whether it's pain caused by injury and illness or competition and conflict, whether it's enduring prolonged famine, coping with the presence of people, or experiencing a rapidly changing climate, brown bears must remain resilient in the face of challenge and hardship in order to survive. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And joining me today is Ranger Naomi Boak. She's standing on the Brooks River, or on the bank of Brooks River in Katmai National Park, Alaska. And today we're here to discuss the myriad ways that bears remain resilient to meet the challenges that they face in their lives. Naomi, great to speak with you once again.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Resilience is something that fascinates me with bears because they surprise us in so many ways.
Absolutely. And before we get into the body of our program, I do want to remind everybody to please take the BearCam viewer survey if you haven't done that already. I'm working with a team of researchers, and we're very interested to know about your BearCam viewing experience and also your opinions on how the BearCam experience affects your views on wildlife conservation. You can find a link for that in the featured comment below the live camera feed on explore.org. So please just scroll down a little bit and you'll find a link to that survey. And thank you very much if you've taken it already. Naomi, like you mentioned, it's a fascinating topic to discuss the resiliency of these animals. And where you're standing, I mean, it's really easy to look at Brooks River and look at Katmai National Park as a land of plenty for bears. And there's many truths to that statement. Bears there have access to some of the largest salmon runs on Earth. They live in one of the largest national parks in the United States. They can find ample denning sites, and people don't significantly influence their mortality within the national park. But bears lead hard lives overall. And for them, hardship begins about as soon as they exit the den for the first time as spring cubs.
Yeah, surviving that first year or surviving being a cub may be one of the biggest challenges that the bears here face in terms of um, being resilient and overcoming obstacles. They're very tiny when they leave the den with their mom, and they're just building up their muscles and learning how to survive, and it's a long, can be a long, difficult trek from from the den, which is maybe a few thousand, 2 to 3,000 feet above where we are. Could be still a lot of snow on the ground. I bet there's a bunch of swimming that those cubs have to do. So even getting here can be challenging, and we never know how many cubs a sow has actually had before they get here. Maybe they've lost a cub. We also see here in that first year, we see sows lose cubs, and it affects us a lot. Like last week when we saw 803 lose one of her cubs. We forget because it is such a rich and vibrant environment for the bears, and perhaps our survival rate for cubs is a little better here, but generally for brown bears, the survival rate is 30 to 35%, and those are big odds against surviving, but they do survive. They get stronger. They learn how to fish in those years. They learn how to be scrappy and to be prepared to take their own place in the world. And they sometimes have trouble with disease, as we've also seen a few years ago. Bear 451 had 2 yearlings, and some of you cam viewers who were around watched for 3 days as that cub died. And that cub had what is known as canine adenovirus, and that's a very common disease for bears here. They're There has been a paper about that, and that for adults, it's a lot easier for them to survive that disease. But cubs, it can be fatal. So bears recover from a lot of things, but they face a lot of hardships. So, Mike, what about injury and disease? What are those obstacles that the bears here face?
Well, I don't think we know the full extent of the amount of injury and disease that wild bears experience. However, if we know that our domestic dogs, for instance, experience a wide range of injuries, illness throughout their lives, or potential for injuries and illness. So wild bears probably experience an equivalent amount. There's more and more research coming out all the time about certain discoveries that give us some insight on how they're surviving a lot of these difficulties overall. But unfortunately we probably don't really know the full extent of the injuries and disease that a lot of these bears encounter. However, I want to give everyone one example from a bear actually from Europe that will help us to better understand just how much injury they endure when they are living their normal lives. So there was a paper that came out in 2001, and actually I think some Bear Cam viewers discovered this paper, and I read it and I found it actually fascinating. So Bear Cam viewers, please continue to share all that interesting stuff that you find online about bears. But this was a paper titled Description of Pathological Conditions in the Skeleton of an Adult Male Brown Bear from the Cantabrian Range of Mountains in Spain. And it's freely available online if you want to look it up and really look at the nuts and bolts of what this bear went through. But the researchers who published that paper, they took a look at this dead bear, its skeleton, thoroughly, head to toe, looking from its skull all the way down to its front toes, all the way from it throughout its vertebra and its back and its rib cage, basically looking at every bone in the body all the way down to its hind feet. And they found that this bear was just riddled with injuries and healed fractures that he had sustained, and also some systemic injuries that he had been suffering throughout his life. Just to start with his teeth, for instance, he had two missing teeth. I'm just going to read a list here of things that I found in this study. A list of he had two missing teeth. He had broken canines. He had deep cavities and other tooth decay. He had fistulae connecting the upper mouth and nasal cavity. So basically, he had holes in the top of his mouth that connected to his nasal cavity. Infections. He had the bones of his paws were fused together, many of them, it seemed like, from a systemic infection. And in his backbone, he had a fused seventh, eighth, and ninth vertebra, probably from a systemic infection as well. And then when you look at the rest of his skeleton, I mean, he suffered through a lot to grow just to 20 years old. He had broken ribs, a broken shoulder blade that he experienced sometime in the past. He fractured both his left and right fibula in his rear legs. He broke his right tibia, and the bones in his right forearm, the radius and ulna, were crushed. So they were just from some catastrophic injury. They ended up healing, and somehow he was able to walk on that. But by the time he actually died, his left arm really was the only healthy limb that he had. And then one final, I mean, this to me was also a very surprising injury. But he had a broken baculum, and that's his penis bone. So I mean, this bear experienced in his life, but he ended up persevering through it and surviving through that for many different or for many years. And no bear at Brooks River has had their skeleton examined as thoroughly, but we have some tidbits of information from bears here and there that help us to understand that, yeah, a lot of bears at Brooks River and in Katmai and wild bears in general are just experiencing a lot of injuries and illness and disease. In fact, one bear that I want to discuss is number 130 Tundra. When she was a yearling cub, like this is a picture of Tundra in 2008. She received a bloody wound above her eye, her left eye. We don't know how. We just saw her along the river with a wound that looked fairly significant, but I always assumed it was just a flesh wound. She healed through that fairly quickly, and by the end of the year, she was just being a normal, playful yearling, playing with her sibling bear, and she ended up growing into a young adult. And then we ended up, unfortunately, finding her body along the banks of Brooks River in July 2014. So she was just about 7 years old at that time. We don't really know what killed her. Probably was another bear. I think that's our best guess that the rangers were able to determine. I never was able to physically look at her body, just photographs. But when uh, to make a long story short, her carcass was taken into the forest, so it wouldn't attract a defensive bear that might want to protect it from a human as a food source. But a ranger, after that body had mostly been decomposed, went and collected the skull from her, and he cleaned it. He brought it back to me, and when I saw the skull, I actually um, was shocked at the extent of the injury that that was on her head. Because again, I just assumed that Tundra experienced a flesh wound. But if you look at this image here, we're looking on the left side of the photograph that's looking straight down on 130 Tundra's skull, and you can see how misshapen the right side of that skull is, or her left side of that skull. And if you look at the right side of that photo, you're looking at the skull from back to front, and you can see that it is very asymmetrical. So at some point when she was a yearling, she suffered, it looks like a pretty significant skull fracture, but she just went about her business. She was, again, playful, doing her best to survive. She had a very protective and healthy mother at the time, number 409 Beano, so I'm sure that helped out a lot. But even these young bears are quite tolerant of pain, able to deal with pain in their own way, and just go about their business of living. And we see that extending throughout adulthood. Recently, number 856, for instance, we've seen him limping along Brooks River, and a lot of people were wondering whether he was going to be able to maintain his really high level of dominance at the river. If you're not familiar with 856, he's the most consistently dominant bear on the river over the past almost 10 years. But he was limping pretty significantly a couple of weeks ago. Yesterday, though, or not yesterday, but 2 days ago, he actually seems like he was back to his old self. So whatever injury had ailed him for that moment, it was just very temporary, and he's gotten over that really quickly. And he's been able to challenge other bears, like number 32 Chunk, for instance. We saw him just a couple of days ago challenging bears near Brooks Falls. So bears are able to get over these injuries and diseases as best they can. They're very tough animals overall. And 856, I think, is a great example, Naomi, of bears being resilient in the face of daily conflict, because we see 856 in the midst of conflict almost constantly when he's at the river.
That's right. And I have to say, Mike, listening to that litany of injuries, I want to take an ibuprofen just listening to those. But yeah, I mean, I think that bears here, I mean, there's so many wonderful, rich things in this ecosystem for them, but there are daily conflicts and daily challenges for them. And some they're able to withstand those, some because of their physical nature, their biology. Obviously, they're able to withstand a lot of pain, but it also has to do with their behavior because when take 856 for example, when he was injured this last week, um, he didn't try to defend his position in the jacuzzi, which is his favorite fishing spot, and normally he just strolls in there and gives someone a dirty look if they try to take it away from him. But he retreated to the riffles where he would not have competition or challenges from another bear who might like 32, who might think this is my opportunity to move up in the hierarchy. So there are a lot of things besides just their biology in their daily living, in terms of their behavior. Look at 151, who is a less dominant bear. He will try to avoid conflict by eating in the riffles most of the season. And I like to talk about 856 a lot in terms of behavior because he's not the most dominant bear just because he's big and because he fights. He's got attitude, and it's an attitude that keeps him away from conflict, because if he had to fight with other bears every day to maintain that fishing spot and do what he wants to do in terms of get fat and have access to females, he might sustain an injury that he can't recover from. And so his behavior, which is more show than go, is part of what protects him. So, a bear, he sees a bear that might be about to go near his favorite fishing spot or near a female. He, lowers his head and he gets in an aggressive position, but he really rarely fights. So that's another thing that makes these bears resilient, because if they did not learn those behaviors, they would be fighting all the time. They might get broken legs that would really hinder them, broken jaws. I mean, we see Otis that has trouble eating because he's missing some teeth. But think if he had a broken jaw. I mean, that would be a real hindrance to their survival. And speaking of that, we really want to talk about preparing for famine, which is another challenge that bears face every day. They have 6 months of famine, and they survive by eating as much fat as they can so that their bodies live off that famine. So they've got this, ecological challenge where there's no food available, and their biology really takes care of that. They preserve energy. They don't lose muscle mass when they're in hibernation. If we were that still for that long, we would lose muscle mass. We wouldn't be able to walk when we get out of the den. Mike, you should know this. You've been in a den, not for very long, but
No, no.
and so and another biological thing that makes bears resilient and helps them survive that famine is something called hyperphagia, which towards the end of our season here, or the bear season, I should say, their bodies, their metabolism changes, and they want to eat everything. They cannot stop eating. We see them grow to enormous sizes, and we think, especially like a bear like 747, we think that bear is ready to den. But no, they won't stop eating. And this is a metabolic change. It's a physiological change that makes them more resilient, able to survive that famine. And if you watch this season, watch the cubs at the end of the season, because they go through this metabolic change as well. And you will see them fighting each other for scraps of fish. They will be much more demanding of mom, wanting to get more of her milk. So again, just bears are just so fascinating. Much to learn from them. Um, Mike, in that famine period, just exactly how do they survive?
Well, we don't fully, that's another thing that we don't fully know about bears. We have a pretty good idea of how they survive hibernation, but we don't know all of their tricks and secrets quite yet. Uh, Naomi, I know we've mentioned a lot of bear nicknames and numbers so far. Before I get to talking about hibernation, how bears are resilient in that, I just want to take a moment to let everyone know that if you want to learn more about these individual bears, Katmai National Park publishes a book every year, and I know Naomi's working very quickly or hard and quickly to try to get out the 2020 version right now. But it's called The Bears of Brooks River: A Guide to Their Life, Identification, and Habits. And you can find that on Katmai National Park's website, which is nps.gov/KATM, or maybe the easiest way to find it is just go to a search engine, type in Katmai ebook, and it should be the page where you can download that from is should be the first hit for you. So check that out if you want to know more about the stories of Tundra, for instance, or 747, 856. A lot of these other bears that we're gonna that we've talked about so far, and some more as well. Yeah, because Naomi, the hibernation physiology is really a fascinating thing. It's the bears are mammals, so they have a lot of similarities with our own bodies, but they could be so different in so many different ways. And I think one great example of that just happens to be Holly. Holly is a well-known bear, number 435. This is her sporting her stuff last year for Fat Bear Week. She was the Fat Bear Week champion last year. One of the greatest, I think, gifts of bears ever. This is a photo. Maybe, I don't know if this is your photo or a photographer's photo, Naomi, but this is her last fall, really at her peak body mass. When she came out of the den, she weighed several hundred pounds less than what we see right here. And she also came back with a spring cub this year. So she's not only surviving hibernation on that body fat, but she's also giving birth in the den, and she's also for, nurturing her cub and feeding her cub in that process. So bears are the only mammals that give birth in the den. They lactate in the den while they're hibernating. And hibernation, so that's on top of the other hibernation physiological challenges that they experience. Hibernation presents significant challenges for mammals. Just think about what we need in order to stay healthy. We need regular exercise to prevent muscle loss and promote bone health. If we stay in bed too long, if we're immobilized for whatever reason, then we quickly lose muscle mass and muscle strength and muscle endurance. Our hearts weaken as well. If you stay in bed long enough, you really have actually a hard time, like after a significant injury, for example. If you try to stand up, your body has a very difficult time adjusting to that. Your bones become brittle and are more likely to fracture. You experience something called disuse osteoporosis. But when bears go into a den, and in their dens, to back up just a little bit, their dens are really no bigger than what they need to just kind of like turn around in. They're cozy spaces, so not very large. Uh, when bears go into the den, they don't have the opportunity to exercise. They don't have the opportunity to eat a healthy diet to make sure that they have the nutrients necessary to survive that period. Everything that they need to survive is contained within their bodies overall, except for oxygen. Oxygen is really the only thing they intake from the environment in winter. So they're able to maintain their bone health, their organ health, their muscle health throughout this prolonged period of famine and immobilization. Just with bone health, that's one of the more, one of the mysterious ways that bears are able to stay healthy in the den. But they may be able to switch on and off certain suites of genes that help to promote bone formation, for example, and bone turnover. So it seems like they're constantly sort of recycling their bones while in hibernation, even though they're not experiencing like the physical impact that helps to stimulate bone development and growth in humans. They might retain more vitamin D, for instance, before they go into the den to help keep their bones healthy. There's some evidence that suggests that bears may suppress the normal mechanisms for bone turnover and reformation in the den. And the sum of these efforts really do prevent brittle bones with them and osteoporosis. And then their muscle health, just to touch on that. Again, they're not exercising in the den when they're uh, when uh, when they're hibernating, but they're able to keep their muscles healthy. They're able to recycle their body's waste products back into their tissues, and that they utilize a special suite of bacteria in their gut to help turn basically poisons from their normal body metabolism, things that we would normally urinate out, uh, into protein that they can use to keep their muscles healthy. So they are maybe the most advanced mammal hibernators. And one other, I know I want to get back to you, Naomi, here in just a second. I don't want to monopolize the whole chat. I
That's
probably could
okay.
talk about hibernation all day. But one other thing that I want to mention is that they have the ability to heal while they're in the den, and they're hypothermic during this time. I mean, their body temperature is probably 8 to 10 degrees below their active levels in the summertime. And we know for our own bodies, if we want to be able to heal, like a bone injury or a wound that we have, we need to have good blood circulation around that area. We need to keep that area of our body at a proper temperature, a normal active body temperature. But bears have a very low body temperature during their hibernation period, relative to their active temperatures, and they also have a very low heart rate, something like only 8 or 10 beats a minute. And that's they're pumping so little blood that if we had a heart rate that low, we would just die. We wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen throughout our bodies. So they're able to heal wounds, broken bones while they're in the den. I mean, enduring famine and during the hibernation process itself, it's just a remarkable way that bears are that they are resilient animals. Uh, but when they're in the den, they're generally not disturbed by people. When they're out of the den, Naomi, transition back to something that we want to talk about. Humans are a part of their daily lives, and that's something that also they need to be able to adapt to. So at Brooks River and other places, how are bears adapting to the presence of humanity?
Well, I think that's an evolving thing. I wanted to add one more thing about the hibernation,
Sure.
which is kind of miraculous, and it's another protective biological mechanism. And Holly's a great example of that, which is what's called delayed implantation. And for females, if they are not healthy enough and they are not fat enough, they will not get pregnant. They may have mated and have embryos, but those embryos will not implant unless they're healthy enough. And that is such a biological protection. And we don't think about that much here along the Brooks River because these bears have so much salmon and can eat so much fat. But think of a year when there's not a good salmon run. There may not be very many offspring. We may not see a lot of spring cubs because to protect the female's life, she will not get pregnant. So just another amazing fact. But then when they come out of the den around here, they have to deal with us. They have to deal with humans. And I must say that around here, the bears of the Brooks River have adapted to us, and it allows them to survive pretty well without much conflict. They, because of what we talked about earlier, and the fact that bears bears get along with each other through a system of hierarchy. Because of that, they get used to us. And by getting used to us, they can ignore us pretty much and not have a lot of conflict with us. But we do have impact. When there are anglers out there, they have to figure out how to get fish around them. They are wary of us sometimes. The other thing that has a great impact on bears is climate change. And Mike, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, bears have an ability individually to adapt more or less to our presence in time or space. For example, maybe they'll avoid the river if they're not comfortable with our presence, find another place to make a living. But with climate change, that's something that's going to touch all wildlife across the planet and already is, for example. And when we think of the resiliency of bears, one bear that I often think of at Brooks River is bear number 503. He has a fairly unique story overall. He separated from his mother as a yearling. He ended up finding a tolerant female. We've talked about her already, number 435, Holly. Holly had a spring cub that year. She adopted him into her family, and he ended up spending 2 summers with her. And now he's a relatively young adult, but still a rapidly growing young adult. He has the potential to become a very successful bear, perhaps a very large bear and a very dominant bear. I think, though, that he'll have trouble doing that, and all of our bears will have trouble doing that if we allow, of course, unmitigated climate change to throttle his home and his food source. Katmai's ecosystem right now is largely intact, and and bears can find a wide variety of food within the ecosystem itself. They're omnivores, so they eat both plants and animals. But in Katmai National Park and throughout the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and most of coastal Alaska, one of the most important foods for bears, and especially the population of bears in Katmai, is salmon. And salmon may be the species that we see impacted the most by a changing climate, not only with warmer ocean conditions and acidifying oceans, but also warmer water temperatures in their spawning and rearing areas. Right now, it seems like the freshwater habitat is doing really, really well because we're seeing a lot of salmon fry and salmon smolts surviving to run out to sea, and then maybe a lot of adults coming back. But we know that other salmon populations throughout North America aren't doing nearly as well. They're already experiencing the challenges that a more acidic ocean poses for these fish. And ocean acidification just ends up disrupting food webs in the ocean, starting with the plankton that young salmon rely on to eat when they go out to sea. And so when we may be transitioning to a point in time in the near future, in the next several decades, certainly by the end of the century, if we continue on our current path of carbon emissions, that the North Pacific is going to lose most of its habitat for salmon. So that is, again, a concern of mine, and I know it's a concern of people throughout North America and throughout the world. But that's bear. There will probably always be bears in Katmai as long as Katmai National Park exists. But the survival of the ecosystem as we know it, the population of bears that we have come to love right now, the gatherings of bears that we see along Brooks River and other salmon streams in Katmai, those things just won't exist without salmon. So, climate change is, I think, a big question mark for the future of these animals and these ecosystems. And they're very resilient. I think we can give them the opportunity to survive, and they certainly will. But things could be very, very different from these animals and more challenging in the future. And Naomi, I know you had some closing thoughts for our conversation today. It's been great to speak with you.
Yeah, this has been fun. We could probably go on and on and on about the resiliency of
I think
bears, and
so.
I know that the people watching have tons of examples. But I did want to say that here along the Brooks River, bears have a lot of wonderful rewards and challenges. This is a really at this time a very healthy and rich ecosystem. Um, but it may not always be that way. And I think one thing that we should all remember is not to anthropomorphize our strengths and weaknesses, because bears are very different creatures. I mean, just listening to Mike talk about all the broken bones and teeth and infections and things that you and I would be, at our doctors constantly or out on painkillers constantly. And so they can survive really well on things that we can't. There's certain things that we do that bears can't. I haven't seen a bear fly a plane yet. So I think if we remember that bears are really amazing creatures and that they can survive an awful lot, and if you continue to watch the bear cams here at explore.org, you will see that. You will see examples of like 856, who couldn't put any weight on his back leg, and then he's out there bossing other bears around. And then you'll see examples like 803's cub, which just didn't make it. And so learn from these stories. We scientists have so much to learn about bears' biology and their behavior, and we as citizen science can also observe, note, and learn so much from these resilient creatures. So this has been great fun talking with you today, Mike, and I hope you all have lots of comments. I'm not sure we have time for questions, Mike. Do you think we have any time for questions?
Well, probably not today, but Naomi and I
Okay.
will be online at from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow evening in the comments on the explore.org Brooks live chat channel. So the same place you're watching this right now, go down to the bottom of the screen tomorrow at 5 p.m. tomorrow, and we'll be there to answer your questions in the comments. We'll be typing along with you there. And then I'll also be online tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time for a live play-by-play broadcast where I narrate the bear and salmon activity that we see at Brooks Falls. So I hope everyone will join us for those broadcasts. Naomi, yeah, it's been great talking to you today. Fascinating topic. I think we have a lot more to share, and we'll try to do that in the future with everybody today. My name is
Yeah.
Mike Fitz with Explore.org. My guest today has been Ranger Naomi Boak with Katmai National Park. And I hope everyone is able to stay healthy and resilient in this challenging time. I'll talk to you later.